The mop hit the marble floor at 5:47 every morning. Before the elevators hummed to life. Before the coffee machines gurgled in the executive lounge. Before the $1,000 suits walked through the revolving glass doors of Harrington Capital, the most powerful investment firm on the Eastern Seaboard, there was Daniel Cole. 61 years old. Salt and pepper stubble. Worn boots that had been resoled twice. A gray janitor's uniform with his name stitched above the left pocket in faded blue thread. He never complained. Never called in sick. In 11 years at Harrington Capital, Daniel Cole had missed exactly 0 days of work. The security guards knew him. The overnight receptionists knew him. But the people who mattered, the ones whose names appeared on Forbes lists and charity galas, they looked right through him. The way people look through glass, acknowledging its existence only when it needs cleaning. Daniel preferred it that way. The morning everything changed started like every other. He was buffing the lobby floor when the elevator doors opened and Marcus Harrington III stepped out, 34 years old. Third-generation wealth. The kind of handsome that comes from never having worried about a bill in his life. Behind him trailed 4 junior analysts. Their laptops clutched to their chests like shields. Marcus was on his phone, pacing, his voice sharp enough to cut the morning air. I don't care what Reynolds says. Pull the Meridian account. All of it. He snapped his fingers at one of the analysts. Get me the Caldwell file. Now. He walked directly into Daniel's path without looking up. Daniel stepped aside quietly, pulling the mop bucket out of the way. Marcus stopped. Looked down at the wet floor. Then at Daniel. Watch where you're cleaning, he said flatly. Not cruel. Just indifferent. The way you'd speak to furniture. Yes, sir. Sorry, sir, Daniel said. Marcus was already walking away. One of the junior analysts, a young woman named Claire Owens, 3 weeks into her first real job, glanced back at Daniel. She offered a small, uncomfortable smile. An apology she didn't know how to say out loud. Daniel nodded. He understood. He'd understood for 11 years. What none of them knew, what nobody in that building knew, was what Daniel did when he went home. He lived in a 2-bedroom apartment in South Baltimore. The second bedroom had no bed. It had a desk, 3 monitors, and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined with economics texts, philosophy, behavioral theory, and market history. Keynes, Taleb, Kahneman, Dalio. Books. With broken spines and margins. Filled with handwriting so small it looked like code. Every night, from 8 p.m. to 2 a.m., Daniel wrote. Not a diary. Not fiction. A newsletter. It had no photographs. No branding. No author name. Just a plain header, The Basement View. He had started it 7 years ago as an exercise, a way to process what he observed during his hours of invisible work. Because when you are invisible, people say things they would never say if they knew someone was listening. He heard conversations in hallways. Overheard strategy meetings through glass walls while emptying trash. Absorbed the language of money, of power, of fear, the real fear that lives behind expensive watches and corner offices. And then he wrote about it. Clearly. Honestly. Without flattery or fury. The first year, he had 11 subscribers. His neighbor. A librarian. A retired schoolteacher in Ohio who had found the link on a forum. By year 3, he had 4,000. By year 6, 60,000. Nobody knew who wrote it. The finance world had spent years trying to identify the basement voice, as readers called the anonymous author. Hedge fund managers forwarded individual essays to their teams. A professor at Wharton had assigned 3 of his pieces as required reading. A sitting U.S. senator had quoted him, without knowing who he was, during a committee hearing on market regulation. The Basement View had, quietly and without ceremony, become one of the most influential financial newsletters in the country. And its author mopped floors for $9 above minimum wage. The crisis hit on a Wednesday. Harrington Capital announced a massive restructuring, a merger with a Pacific Rim conglomerate that, on paper, looked like a triumph. Marcus Harrington III held a press conference. He wore a blue tie. He smiled the smile of a man who had never considered the possibility of being wrong. That night, Daniel sat at his desk. He had watched the press conference on his laptop during his lunch break, eating a ham sandwich in the basement break room. He had heard the numbers. He had heard what wasn't said. He had read the body language of the CFO standing slightly behind Marcus, the microtension in the jaw. The hands folded too deliberately. He wrote for 4 hours. The piece was called "The Emperor's New Merger, Why Harrington Capital Just Made the Most Expensive Mistake of the Decade." He posted it at 1:14 a.m. By 6 a.m., it had been shared 1,100 times. By the time Daniel clocked in and began mopping the Harrington Capital lobby, his essay was being read by the very people whose lobby he was cleaning. He didn't know this, of course. He never knew the immediate impact. He posted and then he slept. But Claire Owens knew. She had been up since 4 a.m., unable to sleep, anxious about the merger numbers that hadn't added up in her own calculations. She was a junior analyst, too junior to say anything, too new to trust her own instincts over Marcus Harrington's confidence. Then a colleague had texted her the link. She read it twice. Then a third time. Her hands were shaking by the end, not from fear, but from the strange, vertiginous sensation of having every doubt she'd had in the past 2 weeks articulated with surgical precision by someone who clearly understood the architecture of this deal better than anyone in the building. She printed it, brought it to her senior analyst, who brought it to the director of risk, who brought it, against every political instinct he had, to Marcus Harrington III. By 10 a.m., 3 floors above where Daniel was cleaning the executive washrooms, a meeting was happening that would determine the fate of billions of dollars. Marcus read the piece standing up. No one spoke. The only sound was the air conditioning and the faint, distant sound of a cart with a squeaky wheel moving down the hallway. When he finished, he set the papers down on the conference table. "Who is this?" he said quietly. "No one knows," the director of risk said. "The newsletter has been anonymous for 7 years. The best analysts on Wall Street have tried to identify the author. Nothing." 7 years, Marcus repeated. He looked out the window at the Baltimore skyline. And in 7 years, how often has he been wrong? A pause. Twice, someone said. Minor calls. On the major ones, another pause. He's been right every time. The room was very still. "Cancel the press rollout," Marcus said. "We're pulling back on the merger timeline until we've stress-tested every assumption in this piece." He picked up the papers again. Every single one. What happened next took 3 weeks. The merger was restructured. 2 of the problematic clauses that the basement view had identified were renegotiated. The CFO, who had been quietly uncomfortable from the beginning, was finally given room to speak. When the revised deal was announced, the market response was calm, measured, positive. A financial journalist wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal. How an anonymous newsletter saved a billion-dollar deal. The hunt for the author intensified. And still, every morning, Daniel Cole arrived at 5:47 a.m. and mopped the marble floors of Harrington Capital. It was Claire who found him. She hadn't been trying to unmask him, she had been trying to thank him. She had started reading the basement view obsessively, pulling up old archives, reading every piece chronologically, trying to understand how someone saw the world this way. And then one evening, working late, she rode the elevator down to the lobby. The cleaning crew was finishing up. Daniel was there, unplugging his cart near the service hallway. She watched him for a moment. He moved with a kind of quiet efficiency. No wasted motion. Everything deliberate. Something made her stop. She had been in the lobby 100 times. But she had never really looked at the men who cleaned it. She thought about something the newsletter's author had written once. In an early piece she'd found in the archives. The most dangerous bias in finance is not greed. It is the assumption that intelligence wears expensive clothes. She looked at Daniel. She looked at his hands, calloused, patient, careful. And she felt, without any evidence she could name, a certainty that landed in her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She walked toward him. "Excuse me," she said. Daniel looked up. He recognized her, the young woman who had smiled apologetically 3 weeks ago. "Yes, ma'am." "I know this is going to sound strange," Claire said slowly. "But I need to ask you something. And I need you to be honest with me." Daniel waited. She pulled out her phone. Showed him the basement view homepage. "Do you write this?" The lobby was empty. Somewhere above them, the building breathed its night sounds. Daniel looked at the screen for a long moment. Then he looked at her. And he said nothing. But the silence was its own answer, vast and layered and quiet. Like the man himself. Claire's eyes filled. She didn't fully understand why. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you stay here? You could be anywhere. Do anything. People would pay you." "I see things here that I can't see anywhere else," Daniel said simply. "The truth about money isn't in the boardroom. It's in the lobby." He looked down at the mop in his hand. "It's in what people say when they think no one important is listening." Claire stared at him. "They never looked at you," she said. It wasn't an accusation. It was an awakening. "No," Daniel said. "They never did." She didn't tell anyone. She went home and she sat with it for a long time. 3 days later, she left an envelope at the building's service entrance. Addressed simply to Daniel. Inside was a single note card. She had written. "I looked. See." Daniel read it at his desk that night. He set it down carefully. He looked at the bookshelves, at the 3 monitors. At the 11 years of observation. And thought stacked in physical and digital form around him. Then he opened a new document. And he began to write. The piece was called, "On Being Seen." It was the first time in 7 years that the basement view had ever been personal. It went. "I have mopped the floors of powerful buildings for a long time. I have watched fortunes made and lost while holding a mop handle. I have written about all of it, the pride, the blindness, the genius, the fear. And I have done so anonymously because the message matters more than the messenger. But tonight, someone looked at me. Really looked. And I realized, invisibility is useful. But it is not without cost. So here is who I am. Not because power or recognition demands it. But because one young woman reminded me that being seen, truly seen, is not a weakness. It is, perhaps, the whole point." He attached his name to the newsletter for the first time. Daniel Cole. Janitor. Baltimore, Maryland. By morning, the world knew. By afternoon, his phone, a 4-year-old Android he almost never used, would not stop ringing. But at 5:47 a.m., before any of that began, Daniel Cole walked through the service entrance of Harrington Capital. Clocked in, filled his mop bucket. And began to clean. Because the floors still needed mopping. And the truth still needed telling. And he had never, in 61 years, confused the two.